Yo, hello everybody. Hey, thanks for coming out. My name's Tommy Tallarico, and I've been in the video game industry for 29 years. And when I first started in the industry, I was hired as a games tester for Virgin. And this is back in the late 80s, early 90s. And but what I'd do is I would bug the vice president of the company every day to please let me do music, and music's what I want to do. And I had no idea how to do music back then. There wasn't really any tools or technology. So, you know, most of the people who did music back in those early days were programmers. So, you know, programmers had to do the music. There was no such thing as a video game composer. You were a programmer, and the programmers who knew about music would, you know, kind of do the music. And so, but I wanted to learn how to do that, and I wasn't really a computer programmer at all. So what I did was I'd bug the vice president of the company every day, please let me do music. And so one of the first games that they were working on internally at Virgin was the original Prince of Persia with Jordan Mechner, and we were doing ports of that game. And so they said, okay, Tom, if you want to, you know, try to figure out how to do sound for this, go ahead. And so we were doing like, you know, there's like the NES and the Game Boy, which had pretty much the similar, it was the same audio chip, pretty much. The Game Boy version, so it had three, they were called PSG channels. There were three, you know, boo, you know, kind of like that. And then the fourth channel was a white noise. And if you, so some of the things that you could mess with were the attack and the decay and the release, and sometimes the vibrato of those tones. So you could take like a sine wave, which is just ooh, but if you set the attack of it really quick, it'd be like boo, you know, it's like boo, and then the release, when you would release the sound, it would go boo, you know, so it would like kind of fade out, like a volume fade. And then with the white noise, of course, if you went shh, that was the white noise channel. But if you had a quick attack, you could go like, and then a quick cutoff, you get, oh, that kind of sounds like a snare drum for, you know, a percussion sound. So how did I get these sounds when there's nothing that was written? There was no audio drivers really. So what I did is I sat down with the program. I got my big chance. They said, okay, you can do you know, the music to Prince of Persia. And so we were doing it on the Game Boy version at this point. So I would sit down, I got the files, a lot of the audio files from Jordan Mechner for certain parts of the music, like the intro. And then we had to, you know, create music. And at first they were like, well, why don't you just, you know, so we want you to create music for all the different levels of the game. And my whole approach, even at that time, was, well, you know, there doesn't have to be music during the entire game. You know, every video game, mostly platform games back then, it had music from the time, you know, take Mario Brothers, for example, Sonic the Hedgehog, whatever, it was always music right from the start all the way through. And when I saw Prince of Persia, the thing that Jordan was doing with the animations, I don't know how much you might know about Prince of Persia, but what made Prince of Persia really revolutionary at the time is Jordan would, you know, he would film himself running and jumping and climbing and all these things. He'd film himself, and then he would take that, because he was the programmer, he was the artist, he was everything, and then he would take that and he would kind of, you know, freeze the frames and draw the pixels to the frame. So that's why the animations in Prince of Persia were actually really ahead of their time. It was the first game that really had smooth animations like that. And so so when I would see that, and I was like, well, this isn't really a game that should have music all the time. It's kind of dramatic, there's a little bit of a storyline, and so I kind of lobbied for not having music all the time throughout the game. Now that was one, from an artistic standpoint, but two, because I knew there was no way I'd be able to write all that music for this game, not knowing what the hell I was doing. So I wanted to keep it, shorter anyway. And so I sat down with the programmer and I said, how do I make sounds come out of it from the audio chip? Every video game console has a specific dedicated audio chip on it. That's where the sound comes from. I said, how do I talk to that? How do I communicate with it? He says, well, he goes, what I'll do is I'll write a program, and it's basically zeros and ones, and you have 8 boxes across and 8 boxes down. So you have a total of 64 boxes, and then you either put a 0 or a 1 in it. And all of those different zeros or ones, one box might represent the attack, one box might represent the length of the note, one box might represent the decay, and all that stuff. So tweaking the sine wave, and one might represent vibrato, and all this different stuff. So just kind of put in zeros and ones randomly, and then give me that block of 64 zeros and ones, give that back to me, and that will be what the tone of that voicing is. So I have 3 tones, and we'll do that, and of course the 4th thing being the white noise. So you give me back 4 different boxes, and that will be what the sound is. So I had a little Game Boy cartridge driver that you put the cartridge in the Game Boy, and it shows, and it showed the boxes, and then I could either pick a 0 or a 1. So I would just sit there for hours, tweaking this 0. Would it sound better with the 0 or the 1? With the 1, okay. Next box, 0 or the 1? Okay, the 1. 0, oh, that's a 0. And so you go through this, and then I could hear the tone. I could hear bing, oh, that kind of sounds like something. Oh, okay, that maybe can be a sound, and that's how we did the sound effects as well. I would have to fill up this boxes and then, give them, oh, here's the sound of the gate crashing, and so we made the tones. And then he said, okay, great, so that's how I make the sounds, but how do I get you music? See, back in the old days, when there was no audio drivers, in the retro gaming days, music was basically just a paragraph of numbers. And so, for example, the things that you would have would be, they sat down and explained this to me. Okay, here's what the paragraph of numbers are. A keyboard, or a piano, an 88 note, a piano has 88 notes in it, right? In the MIDI world, the musical instrument digital interface world, there's 128, right? So it's 88 on a piano, 128 in the digital world. So you'd have lower notes and higher notes. And middle C was number 60, for example. So what were the things that would be in the paragraph of numbers? The first thing was the note number. So middle C was 60. So you'd say, okay, you put in a 60. And then you'd put a comma. And then the next thing was, what is the length of that note that you just pressed? Okay, you had to figure out what that was, right? Maybe it could be, 438, right? So, okay, boom. And then the third number register was, once that 438 number ended, what was the space between when you hit the next note? So those were the 3 things. So it was the note that you're hitting, the pitch, and then the length, and then the space between the next note. And so those were the 3 numbers. And so you would have, say 60, 438, 12, 62, 12, 12, for, in number, in just paragraphs and paragraphs of numbers. So that's how complicated it was back then. So what I had to do was basically, basically write a paragraph of numbers, and then it had to be compiled. And then you would hear it in the game and go, oh gosh, the third note, that's way too long. And again, this wasn't like you weren't writing out sheet music or anything like that. You were just kind of guessing, And that was why a lot of video game music back then was very simple sounding, do, 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 because you didn't want to get into like how do you program the blues? How do you do the blues like this? You can't, right? It's very, very staccato and very you didn't want to get too complicated back then. So, but because this was Prince of Persia, I wanted to, kind of create something that sounded Arabic, that sounded like something that was in, and instead of, because everyone was using that white noise channel to do a snare drum or a percussion thing, what I did is instead I wanted to, like in a lot of times in Middle Eastern music, they use, the thumb, the finger, ping, ping, finger cymbals, right? And I'm like, oh, that would be cool. And so I kind of created a sound for that as well. But dealing with the paragraphs of numbers. So actually I have, let me see, I'll show you an idea of what we came up with, again, with just a paragraph of numbers, and I'll tell you why the paragraph of numbers comes into play. So this is 1991. Let's try They called me Tom Tallarico. I wasn't Tommy back then. It was the only game I ever was Tom Tallarico. And this is, so you can hear kind of the, oops. So we had little things, again, I wanted to make it, hey, when the music comes in, it should be special. Something should be happening, So this was like the, my finest work ever. But one of the channels was like a lower register, so I kind of use that as the bass, and all that stuff. But anyway, so that's a little bit of Prince of Persia. But so then what I did is I sat down with all the programmers and I said, look, so MIDI is a very commonly used, again, musical instrument digital interface. And what that was is, in the late 80s and mid 80s when it was designed, what you could do is you could take a synthesizer keyboard and you had a MIDI cable, and what it did is you could hook the MIDI cable up to other synthesizers, and if you play it together, now you could actually play the sound of this and that one, and you could keep hooking them up. About the third or fourth line down, it started to get a delay, but that's how you got some of those big fat 80s synth sound. There was like 2 or 3 different synthesizers, and you could play different sounds all in one. But the MIDI information, what it was transferring back and forth was the note value, how long the note was, when you released it, and it was the same stuff that I was putting in these paragraphs. So I went to the programmer and I said, look, there's this thing called MIDI, and musical synthesizers, like a cakewalk, like these programs that would record, sequencers they were called, they could record the MIDI notes. So I could take a synthesizer, I could hook it up to a PC, and it would have the sequencer on it, and I could hit record, and I would play the synthesizer, and it would record all the notes that I was doing, and then I could hit play, and it would record it back, like a player piano. And so this was like technology and music, and this is so cool. But I thought to myself, but wait, all that information, couldn't I? So I went to the programmer and said, could you build me a system where, because I don't know programming, but could you build me a system where, and let's take the Sega Genesis, for example. This is the first thing I did it on, because the Genesis had like just come out, and so I had a big cartridge that they built for me that would plug into the Genesis, and it had MIDI cables coming out of it so that I could play the sound chip in real time, live. And so that my MIDI keyboard was hooked into the Sega Genesis, playing the sound chip in real time, and then that was then looped into the sequencer so that it could record all the stuff I was doing, and then it would loop back into the Genesis. So it was a big circle, and what it allowed me to do was to play the Genesis. So the Genesis had 6 channels of FM synthesis. So FM synthesis, it was a really big company, Yamaha, that made keyboards, and one of the most popular keyboards in the 80s was called the DX7. And so it was actually the chip, the sound chip that they used in the DX7. Sega had licensed that for their hardware. And it got, as you all know what the Sega Genesis sounds like, it's basically a little mini synthesizer, you know, so it's got that fat kind of 80s, synth vibe going to it, which was very unique. A lot of the arcade cabinets back then would also use the same chip. So if you listen to some of the old arcade games out there and you hear that kind of synthy, fat sound, that's the same Yamaha chip. And the unique thing was, not only was there 6 channels of FM synthesis, but one of those channels could be used to create a sample that you could record whatever you wanted to. So the most famous sample was when you turned the Genesis on, it went Sega, right? So they were using that one chip. Now the problem was, of course, that whenever you put a sample in, it blew out, the memory was like, you know, one sample would take up like hundreds of K, which was, you know, insanely, you know, no one did that, you know, so Sega could afford bigger cartridges because it was their hardware. So if you remember the early consoles, they only had like, you know, 1 or 2 sounds in it. Maybe it was like fight or start, go, whatever, and that was it, right? And then on this chip, it also had the same chip that I had in the Nintendo stuff, the NES and the Game Boy. It also had those 3 PSG sounds and the white noise channel. No one ever used those though. No, there's not any, I don't know of any game that aside the stuff that I did, that used those other channels, because everyone was so focused on the 6 voice FM because it sounded so much better. So what I would do is I would use those other 3 voices, the 4 voices, I would use them a lot for sound design. So when you would pick up a ring, pling, or the other thing I used them in is I would use it as a guitar digital delay. So when I would play a guitar solo into the Genesis, what I would do is I would take that MIDI file, so let's say it was a guitar solo, and then I would cut and paste it 3 times, right? So 3 more times. So now there was 4 channels, and I would assign, and then what I would do is I would delay each of the channels a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And what that did is that got me digital delay. And so what I would take the envelope of the sound, the attack, decay, sustain, release, all that, and I would make it sound like this. So that beep, you know, the sound that you just heard, and you know, ping, you know, that kind of boop, right? But if I took a long attack and a long decay, it sounded like this. You know, so what I would do is I would play that once, twice, 3 times, and I would stutter step them from the original FM, so when you play guitar, it just sounded like it had reverb or delay on it, which, again, no one was really was doing in the Genesis. So what I did is, one of the first Genesis games that we worked on was a game called Global Gladiators. It was a McDonald's license. And what I had done is, I said, you know what, I'm going to thrash the crap out of this sample channel. Because one of the things was that you could always do priorities. It was all about, when audio was happening, it was all about priorities. How could you put priorities on everything? Because when sound effects happened, something had to fall out, because you wanted to use all 6 channels, or in my case, 10 channels I was using. And so when a sound effect happened, it had to take priority. Okay, but priority over what? The bass line, the drum sound, whatever it was. So we had to decide. So every channel had to be given a certain number, right? And so, so that was kind of the trick back then, was trying to figure out exactly what would fall out when certain things, and what if 2 sound effects happened, and what if 3 sound effects happened, how's that going to affect the music? And so once we got all this stuff together, and then putting in the different priorities was a really important thing. But I want to play a little bit of Global Gladiators. This is just the music, and you'll kind of hear the guitar solo. So what I was able to do was, I had a completely unfair advantage over every single person who was doing game audio at that time, because I had a system that I could play and record into the machine, and I would take that MIDI file, and they would then translate that file into that paragraph of numbers. So they were able to strip out all the stuff it didn't need and create this, this thing. So. Now that snare that you hear is actually a real snare drum that I recorded. Because all the other Genesis snares were like it was really crappy. So, and you hear the kick drum is actually an FM. The snare is actually a real snare drum. I'll get to the guitar solo part. It just sounds a little different from all the other FM stuff right here. And it's subtle, but there's like reverby kind of delay on it. See how I kind of pan up? Anyway, I give you a little bit of idea of that. So what I did is I wanted to use that sample channel and thrash the crap out of it. And so I got together with David Perry, who was the programmer on that, and I said, Dave, I want to just, who cares about space? Let me just go crazy and see if we can convince the folks at Virgin to give us bigger cartridge space, because it was all about budget back then too. So you had these smaller cartridges that, they were mass producing 1 million of these things that they, so if it was $1 more of a cartridge, that was a big deal, but you had more space. So I put together a bunch of samples, and I would put samples in the music all the time. So I do guitar hits, I do orchestral hits, I do snare drums and guitar hits and all this kind of stuff. And in one of them, in the game Cool Spot, which is the next game we did after that, we licensed the music for Wipeout. Because, Cool Spot was come surfing in on a 7-Up can. And so what I did is I sampled that entire drum thing, because the drums to Wipeout are the most important part of the song. And so when I tried to recreate it, because we were also doing the Super Nintendo as well at the time, and the difference with that was I'll get into that in a second. So what I did is I sampled the entire thing. It's like 8 seconds, completely unheard of. So how was I able, now I have to figure out a way to get a big sample into a small amount of space. So what we did is, it was a 16-bit sample, and all of the samples in the Genesis were 8-bit. So basically cut it all in half right from the get-go. But when you listen to a CD, it's at 44,100 kilohertz, right, per second. So 44.1. That's when you listen to a CD. It's 16-bit, 44.1. And so what we had to do is put them in 8 bits about 9 kilohertz, 8 kilohertz, 6 kilohertz, 5 kilohertz. And what that does basically is create just a scratchy piece of crap. That's, you know, it's just awful, because what you're doing is if you can imagine take you know what a waveform looks like you just saw it on the bottom there, right? It's all these, you know, waveforms, all these, you know, the bits of the song. And basically when you downsample, it's called, so those are samples, right? So when you downsample something, you go from 44,000 and you say, I want to downsample it to 5,000. What it's doing is it's taking huge chunks. You're getting downsampled. No, I'm getting downsampled. It's taking huge chunks of data and just taking it out. So imagine like a picture, a painting, right? And you were taking like 10% of the picture every 3 inches. You were taking it out, taking it out. Well, when it comes back, it's not going to really look like the picture anymore. So what I did is I figured out, well, instead of going from 44.1, what I'm going to do is and it was kind of like real-time dithering, where I would take 44.1, then I would downsample it to 43, and then 42, and then 40, and then 38, and 36, and 32. And so it wasn't taking it out in big chunks, it was kind of bringing it down a little bit at a time. And then what I would do is I would run it through a 3D spectrum analysis. Because when you take out the samples, it's affecting the dynamic range of the sound. So you're starting to lose all the high ends, or at the high end of that kilohertz spectrum. You're starting to take those down, and it's losing it. So I would compare the real one with the other one, and as it would start to go down and lose that high end, I would start to re-EQ it. So I would put the high end back in, usually around 32,000. I'm like, ooh, it just lost a little bit there. And so I'm going to put that back in and keep going down and keep going down. And I would EQ it on the way and look in the spectrum analysis to see what was happening and where it was. I used my ear and the sight of it. So I was able to get really big samples and use a lot more samples with very little space, and no one could figure out how I was doing it. And that was how I was doing it. But so here's the intro to Wipeout, using this, like, again, 8-second long sample that people were like, that's impossible. Let's see. So here it is. So I was just looping it, and then I was throwing the FM on top of it. Anyway, so that was that one. But a lot of times what we would do is we would spend a lot of time, I would spend a lot of time on the instruments itself, right? Because I wanted it to sound, the Genesis came with like a bunch of stock sounds. Here's a flute, here's a horn, here's a guitar, and it was all total crap. It all sounded the same, basically. And so what I spent the most time not writing the music or you know, implementing into the game. I spent the most time on the instruments itself to try to get them to sound, you know, better. And so here's a good example. The game we did after Cool Spot was Disney's Aladdin. It was the biggest selling game of that year for the Genesis. And you'll see a little bit of, let me see. So what I had to do with this is, so I worked with Alan Menken, who was the composer of the Aladdin movie, and so I sat down with him, and he gave me all these scores that are like, you know, 72. Yo, yo, yo. Okay, so I would, so he gave me like these 72-piece scores, and I had to figure out, how do you get a 72-voice orchestra in 6 channels? But if you listen to like the flutes and the oboes and so there's like brass things in there. all the little counter melodies and stuff with, so I always felt the voicing was really important in the Genesis, because if you get different sounds, there's a little xylophone thing going on. So the more different sounds I could get, it would sound better, because everyone was using just the same FM stuff. So the more diversified it could get, it'd sound a lot better. Anyway, so the next game we did after that, yay! And then the next game was Earthworm Jim that the team did after that. So for Earthworm Jim, again, we were using samples all over the place, and so we convinced the people for those games, after Aladdin and Global Gladiators and all that, the music sounded so different than what other people were doing that they actually gave us the bigger cartridge. They spent the money. They said, wow, this was really going to help differentiate us. Again, so I had a completely unfair advantage over everybody else because they didn't have the space that I had. So I convinced the powers to be to spend the extra money on the cartridges so we could have more space so the music would be good. So Earthworm Jim, again, I'll play you some music from the Genesis version, and then I'll talk about the Super Nintendo and what made that different. But so here's the Genesis. It's just an MP3. You can turn this, probably have to turn it up a little bit. Thanks. So you hear that big. Now that kick drum is actually a real kick drum. You can tell the difference, right? Boom, boom. You're getting the low end of it. And you can hear that bass is really awesome on the Genesis, real beefy. So the kick and the snare are samples. I always preferred the Genesis over the Super Nintendo for doing music. Because what the Super Nintendo did is they had 8 channels instead of 6, but all of their channels were sample channels. So I had one sample channel on the Genesis, all 8 of them were sample channels on the Super Nintendo. Now that was good and bad. It was good because, wow, 8 set of samples, that's amazing. But you lost all that low end. And because the samples had to be so small, the loops had to be really, really quick. Now the best game to me, I thought, on the Super Nintendo was ActRaiser. Like what Yuzo Koshiro did with the opening of ActRaiser, it was like the first time I had heard a symphony in a video game before. It was amazing. And it was funny because the way you had to, because Nintendo's very, very proprietary about everything they do. So what they did was they would take, so I would have to send them a sample of what I wanted, let's say a horn, and I would have to put it on a DAT tape, send it up to Washington, and then they would encode it with their compression. This is like before MP3s and all this stuff, and then they would send it back. And it pissed off everybody who was doing music, because it's like we had to literally wait weeks, sometimes months, before we got our sounds back from the Nintendo. And it was funny because it was a .sol file. It was what it was called, this shit out of luck, yeah. We're not telling you what our compression is, and you have to deal with it. And so that same song that I just played on the Super Nintendo sounds like this, same exact song. It's missing that like punchy, bassy, synthy, low end thing. Yeah, it's like it didn't do it for me. So I never liked the Super Nintendo as much, and I couldn't use my reverb trick on the guitars and different things. So in regards to the priority stuff, though, I'll play a little bit now of the game from the Genesis, and you can hear, now that you know what the music sounds like, but listen to where all the samples and the sound effects take over. You can see every time, you can turn this one up too, I think. So every time you hear a sound effect, a part of the music is dropping out. That was a sample. The whip is a sample. The crow is a sample. The dog's a sample. And what I would do is I would drop out the percussion. So I would start there. So if you listen, whenever there's a sound, it's dropping out the kick or the snare, but you can't even really tell. Yeah. So I constantly had that sample channel thrashing the crap out of it. And again, most games at the time were just Sega, and that was all you ever heard, right? So anyway, I know we're running a little bit out of time. I wanted, we've got like 10 minutes left, I think, yeah. I wanted to open it up to questions. There's so much more I can get into, but I want to see if there's any questions. Sure, right here. What was the hardware that you used that would bring it, say, from 44 down to 9? Yeah, it was a program. It's now called SoundForge. I was a PC guy. I was never a Mac guy. And we always, so all the audios, which is rare for an audio person, a lot of times audio people always used, Pro Tools, they used Mac. Mac was more of like the artist tool. But in the video game world, all of the tools and technology were done on PCs. So I was basically given a PC as my first computer, so that's what I learned on. Still to this day, I don't have a Mac. I'm a PC guy, but so it was a program that ended up eventually being called SoundForge, which is still around today, but it was a really archaic version of it, and they had a downsample thing. But yeah. Yes.
Are there any pieces of music or sound effects that like haunt your dreams, where you're like, I can't hear that ever?
Yes. that I worked on. Yes, I'll play it for you right now. In fact, you lucky gal. So there's a very famous story. This is the early 90s, 1990, and the vice president of Virgin at the time comes up to me and he says, "Hey, we've been working on this game, and we have to submit it to Nintendo tomorrow, and we don't have any sound on it. So could you?" And I hadn't done an NES game yet. And they said, "Can you do the music for it? Like the music and the sound effects?" I'm like, and learn a driver? Doing the music was kind of the easy part. It was learning the driver to make it sound like, oh Christ, I have these paragraph of numbers. I didn't have my cool MIDI keyboard thing at the time. So I'm like, oh no. I said, sure. And the game was called Color a Dinosaur, which was like a poor man's version of Mario Paint. It wasn't even that good. You couldn't save any of the dinosaurs. It was total crap. And it was, everyone always asked me, what's the worst game you worked on? And I always say, Color a Dinosaur. Here's the interesting thing. Over the years, I always say, oh, how crappy Color a Dinosaur is. And then like the Angry Video Game Nerd did a thing on it. And over the years, all these folks like make fun of the game. And because of it, it actually ended up being, like, to get a Color a Dinosaur in a shrink wrap is, I was just talking to the guys last night about this, is about $7,000 or $8,000. Because the game was so crappy that no one bought it. I've now made it famous through, now everybody wants to have this crappy game that I worked on. But this is the music from Color a Dinosaur, because I'm going to follow up because it's a funny story. So, I mean, it was real. I had to keep it simple. And that's all you get. That's it. That was the whole, and then a loop. And so what I did was, so for the last 30 years, people have been bugging me, because, you know, I do this thing called Video Games Live. It's a big symphony, we put out big albums, and they're like, people are like, you gotta do Color a Dinosaur with the symphony, come on! So the Level 6, we've done a whole bunch of albums, and our Level 6 album just came out last week. It was a Kickstarter project. It's hitting Spotify and Amazon and everything next week, okay? So it's only out to Kickstarters. Well, as a secret surprise, one of the things we did, there's 12 tracks on the album, and the last one, I put a hidden track on the album. No one knows this. It's the first time I'm telling people this. People are going to know about it. I mean, some of the Kickstarters have been talking about it, but so when you get the last track, I put 30 seconds of silence, and then it plays this. Oh wait, okay, so the silence is coming. Where is it going? Keep going. There it is, okay. Musicians, and then that was mixed at Skywalker Ranch. So that's the secret hidden track on the album that comes out next week, so now you know. Agree with me? Yes. 3 minutes left, okay. Couple more questions, yes?
As kind of a pioneer in the video game music industry, what did you think the future was going to be like? I mean, like, say, 2018 or 2010. Do you think you were right in your kind of prognosis?
Yeah, so, I mean, the video game music industry really changed with, you know, the PlayStation. You know, you are now able, in Redbook Audio, it's the Sega CD. So, like, when I did Terminator on the Sega CD, that was the very first time anyone had played a live guitar, recorded a live guitar in a video game. And so, being a musician and not being a programmer, I just love the advent of, you know, being able to perform and record real music. And then once like the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3 came out, we kind of hit our limit. Like, you can now do 64 channels of streaming audio at you know, 5.1 and all this stuff. So yeah, we really, you know, it really took a turn in the 90s. That's when video game music, I think, changed forever. So yeah. One more question we got? Anyone? One more? No? I'll play some Terminator if you want. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Do you have, like, the flip side to her question, do you have, like, a song that either you wrote or someone else wrote that's, like, a favorite?
Well, I mean, the favorite stuff that I wrote, a lot of stuff for Earthworm Jim, because it was so much fun and memorable. But I also worked on a game called Advent Rising, which, hey, that's the guy who bought it. It wasn't a big selling game, but I worked on it for 3 years, and I wrote it as an Italian opera, something I always wanted to do, being 100% Italian too. And so the music won a lot of awards, and it was funny because the soundtrack album sold more copies than the game did. So I'm really proud of that one. But for me, that's my own stuff. But for me, I think the greatest piece of video game music ever written is Nobuo Uematsu, Final Fantasy VIII, Libere Fatale. That's my personal favorite. Yeah, Final Fantasy VIII as a whole. Everyone loves 7 because it's 7. But from a musical standpoint, Eyes on Me, Libere Fatale, I love 8 the best. But
I agree.
Cool, agree, there you go. Cool, well, thanks everybody for coming, and thank you.